Machiavelli's most chilling discovery wasn't about power, warfare, or political strategy. It was about silence and why it represents the most dangerous force in human civilization. In his political observations and historical analysis, Machiavelli documented what he called the silence phenomenon, societies where good people systematically chose to remain quiet in the face of injustice, corruption, and destructive behavior, believing that silence was safer, more prudent, or morally superior to confrontation. These silent individuals convinced themselves they were being wise, diplomatic, or peacekeeping by avoiding conflict and refusing to speak out against obvious wrongs. But Machiavelli discovered something terrifying. Their silence wasn't protecting anything. It was enabling the complete destruction of everything they claimed to value. Machiavelli called this discovery chilling because silent good people weren't just failing to prevent evil. They were actively collaborating with it through their refusal to oppose it. Their silence gave consent to corruption. Their non-confrontation enabled abuse of power. And their desire for peace through avoidance created conditions where the most ruthless and destructive individuals could operate without resistance or consequence. Not because silence itself was evil, but because in a world where destructive people never remain silent, good people's silence becomes the most powerful weapon that evil can possess. Today, I'll reveal Machiavelli's coldest law about why silence threatens everything, and why he believed this phenomenon either leads to the complete collapse of civilized society or forces individuals to develop the courage that transforms silent observers into active guardians of what they value most. Before we continue exploring this revolutionary discovery, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our deep psychology content. Leave your like to support the work and comment which aspect of this topic resonates most with you. Now, let's dive into the discovery that changed everything. The case that revealed Machiavelli's coldest law began with his observation of what he described in his political writings as the good citizen's fatal silence. During his years serving the Florentine Republic, Machiavelli witnessed countless situations where honest, moral individuals remained silent while witnessing corruption, abuse of power, and systematic destruction of the very institutions and values they claimed to cherish most deeply. But Machiavelli quickly realized he wasn't observing random cowardice or occasional moral failure. He was witnessing something far more systematic and civilization-threatening. Machiavelli wrote, "I have observed with great consistency that virtuous citizens who possess clear knowledge of right and wrong and who claim to value justice and good governance systematically choose silence when their voices are most needed to prevent the destruction of what they hold most dear. These silent good people would witness political corruption and say nothing because speaking out might create conflict or make them unpopular. They would observe abuse of power and remain quiet because confrontation felt uncomfortable or potentially dangerous to their social standing. They would see destructive policies being implemented and choose silence because they convinced themselves that others would speak up, that the problems would resolve themselves, or that their individual voice wouldn't make a difference anyway." But Machiavelli observed a devastating pattern. While good people remained silent to avoid conflict and protect their comfort, destructive people never hesitated to speak, act, and organize to advance their harmful agendas. The silence of the virtuous created a vacuum that was immediately filled by the voices and actions of those who had no moral constraints about pursuing their destructive goals. Machiavelli wrote, "The fatal flaw in virtuous people's reasoning is their belief that silence protects them from evil, when in reality, silence enables evil to operate without opposition. They think they are choosing peace by avoiding confrontation, but they are actually choosing destruction by removing all resistance to destructive forces." But Machiavelli discovered something even more chilling about this pattern. Because good people's silence was systematic and predictable, destructive individuals had learned to exploit it strategically. They would implement harmful policies gradually, knowing that good people would remain silent to avoid conflict. They would corrupt institutions slowly, understanding that virtuous people would choose comfort over confrontation. They would abuse power incrementally, recognizing that moral people would rationalize their silence rather than risk the discomfort of opposition. Machiavelli realized he was witnessing what he would later describe as the weaponization of virtue against itself, a process where good people's moral preferences for peace, harmony, and conflict avoidance were systematically exploited by those who had no such constraints, creating conditions where virtue became the enabler of its own destruction. Machiavelli wrote in his Observations, "The most dangerous enemy of good government is not the obviously evil person, but the silent good person whose refusal to oppose evil gives it the permission and space it needs to flourish without resistance. Evil succeeds not through its own strength, but through good systematic refusal to exercise its power." Therefore, Machiavelli began investigating what he would call the mechanics of civilizational collapse through silence. He discovered that the destruction of societies, institutions, and moral orders followed predictable patterns where good people's silence created the conditions that allowed destructive forces to gain complete control. Machiavelli wrote, "Every fallen republic, every corrupted institution, and every society that has descended into tyranny has followed the same pattern. Good people chose silence, while bad people chose action. Virtue chose comfort, while vice chose power. And moral individuals chose peace, while immoral individuals chose control." Modern research by Dr. Philip Zimbardo on the psychology of heroism validates Machiavelli's early observations about the dangers of bystander silence in the face of injustice and abuse. His studies show that societies collapse when good people systematically choose non-involvement over active opposition to destructive forces. But Machiavelli identified something more specific and more threatening: the strategic exploitation of good people's silence by those who understood that virtue's preference for peace could be weaponized against virtue itself. Machiavelli observed that destructive individuals and groups had developed what he called silence exploitation strategies. They would implement harmful policies and behaviors in ways that made opposition uncomfortable, socially costly, or seemingly futile, knowing that good people would choose silence rather than endure these discomforts. Machiavelli wrote, "The corrupt understand that virtue can be neutralized not through direct attack, but through creating conditions where virtuous action feels more costly than virtuous inaction. They make speaking out seem dangerous, confrontation appear futile, and opposition feels socially unacceptable, knowing that good people will choose silence over discomfort." Machiavelli identified 4 distinct types of dangerous silence that enable the destruction of everything good people claim to value. Type 1, the Prudence Excuse Silence. Machiavelli documented individuals who remained silent in the face of obvious wrongs, while convincing themselves that silence was actually wisdom, prudence, or strategic thinking rather than moral cowardice. Machiavelli wrote, "The Prudence Excuse allows good people to avoid the discomfort of confrontation by convincing themselves that silence is actually superior moral reasoning. They claim to be choosing their battles wisely when they are actually avoiding all battles entirely. These individuals would witness corruption, abuse, or destructive behavior and remain silent while telling themselves they were being diplomatic, strategic, or wise by not creating conflict. They would rationalize their inaction as prudent timing, claiming they were waiting for the right moment to act, while never actually finding that moment acceptable for action. Most dangerously, they would convince themselves that their silence was actually more morally sophisticated than the crude or aggressive approach of those who spoke out directly against obvious wrongs, creating moral superiority about their own moral failure. Type 2, the harmony preservation silence. Machiavelli identified individuals who remained silent about destructive behavior because they prioritized maintaining social harmony and avoiding conflict over protecting the values and people being harmed by that behavior. Machiavelli wrote, "The harmony preserver chooses the comfort of false peace over the discomfort of necessary conflict, not understanding that true peace can only be maintained through the willingness to fight for it when it is threatened." These people would witness obviously harmful behavior in families, organizations, or communities and remain silent because speaking out would create drama, cause problems, or disrupt the peace, not recognizing that their silence was allowing much greater harm to continue unchallenged. They would prioritize maintaining comfortable relationships with destructive people over protecting the victims of that destructive behavior, choosing social ease over moral courage and personal comfort, over collective well-being. Type 3, the futility rationalization silence. Machiavelli documented individuals who remained silent while convincing themselves that speaking out wouldn't make any difference, that the problems were too big for their individual voice to matter, or that others should be responsible for taking action. Machiavelli wrote, "The futility rationalizer uses the magnitude of the problem as excuse for personal inaction, not understanding that massive problems exist precisely because individuals like themselves have chosen to believe their individual action doesn't matter." These people would witness systemic corruption, institutional abuse, or widespread destructive behavior and remain silent while telling themselves that one person couldn't make a difference, that the system was too big to change, or that someone else with more power or influence should take responsibility for opposition. They would use the complexity or scale of problems as justification for their own non-participation, not recognizing that their silence was part of what made the problems seem overwhelming and unchangeable. Type 4, the safety prioritization silence. Machiavelli identified the most understandable but ultimately most dangerous category. Individuals who remained silent because speaking out carried genuine risks to their safety, security, or livelihood, but who used these legitimate concerns to justify complete non-resistance to destructive forces. Machiavelli wrote, "The safety prioritizer faces real dangers for speaking out, but fails to recognize that silence in the face of evil ensures that the dangers will only increase and spread until no safety exists for anyone, including themselves." These individuals would witness corruption, abuse, or systematic destruction, while remaining silent because opposition might cost them their jobs, social standing, or physical safety, not understanding that their silence was ensuring these destructive forces would eventually consume everything they were trying to protect through inaction. While their concerns about personal consequences were legitimate, their choice of complete silence rather than strategic resistance ensured that the destructive forces would grow strong enough to eventually destroy even their temporary safety. Understanding your specific silence pattern is crucial because each type requires different approaches to what Machiavelli called strategic courage development. But first, you need to understand why Machiavelli considered this law so cold and threatening. Because Machiavelli observed the devastating civilizational consequences of systematic good people silence, therefore he concluded that virtue's refusal to oppose vice-posed genuine threats to the survival of everything virtuous people claimed to value. Machiavelli identified 3 specific threats that made this law so chilling. Threat 1, the complete corruption of institutions and systems. Machiavelli wrote, "When good people systematically remain silent, every institution and system becomes corrupted because there is no voice of opposition to prevent the gradual takeover by those who have no moral constraints about pursuing destructive goals. When virtuous people consistently chose silence over confrontation, corrupt individuals would gradually infiltrate and take control of governments, organizations, educational institutions, and social systems because their destructive actions met no resistance from those who possessed the moral clarity to recognize and oppose corruption. Machiavelli observed that institutions didn't fall to dramatic coups or obvious takeovers. They were slowly corrupted through the systematic silence of good people who witnessed each step of degradation but chose comfort over confrontation at every critical moment. This gradual corruption was far more dangerous than obvious tyranny because it happened slowly enough that each individual instance of silence seemed reasonable, while the cumulative effect was the complete destruction of institutional integrity and moral foundation. Threat 2, the normalization of destructive behavior. Machiavelli documented how good people's silence created social conditions where harmful, corrupt, and abusive behavior became accepted as normal because no voices of opposition challenged these behaviors when they first appeared. Machiavelli wrote, "Silence gives consent not just to current destructive behavior, but to the principle that such behavior is acceptable. When good people remain silent, they teach society that virtue has no voice, that good has no power, and that destructive behavior can operate without consequence. When moral people consistently refuse to speak out against obviously harmful behavior, they created social environments where destructive individuals understood they could act with impunity, where victims of abuse had no advocates, and where corrupt behavior became normalized through lack of opposition. This normalization was particularly dangerous because it created psychological conditions where even good people began to doubt their own moral perceptions, wondering if behavior that seemed obviously wrong might actually be acceptable since no one was speaking out against it. Threat 3, the elimination of moral courage from human civilization. Most chillingly, Machiavelli found that systematic silence by good people created generational patterns where moral courage disappeared from human society because children learned that virtue meant avoiding confrontation rather than protecting what was right. Machiavelli wrote, "When good people consistently choose silence over courage, they teach the next generation that virtue is passive, that goodness means non-involvement, and that moral people should avoid conflict rather than fight for their values." This creates societies populated entirely by silent observers who witness destruction without opposition. Children who observed virtuous adults remaining silent in the face of obvious wrongs learned that moral behavior meant avoiding difficult conversations, that good people didn't create conflict, and that the appropriate response to witnessing harm was to look the other way rather than take action. This elimination of moral courage from human development created societies where no one possessed the psychological foundation necessary to resist destructive forces, ensuring that civilization would inevitably fall to those who had no moral constraints about pursuing power and control. This is why Machiavelli considered the development of strategic courage not just personally important, but civilizationally urgent. Because systematic silence by good people posed such threats to the survival of virtue and civilized society, therefore, Machiavelli developed what he called the strategic courage method, a systematic approach to overcoming dangerous silence, while developing effective opposition to destructive forces. Phase 1, recognition of silence as collaboration with evil. Machiavelli taught good people to first recognize that their silence in the face of obvious wrongs was not neutral inaction, but active collaboration with destructive forces through the removal of opposition. Machiavelli wrote, "The good person must understand that in conflicts between virtue and vice, there is no neutral ground. Silence is not non-participation. It is participation on the side of whoever is willing to take action, which is always the side of those with the fewest moral constraints. Technique. Machiavelli instructed virtuous individuals to examine the consequences of their silence rather than their intentions for remaining quiet. He taught them to ask themselves honest questions. What does my silence enable? Who benefits from my refusal to speak out? What am I actually protecting through inaction, virtue, or my own comfort? He emphasized that good intentions for silence, desire for peace, prudent timing, or avoiding conflict were irrelevant if the practical consequence was enabling destructive behavior to continue without opposition. Phase 2. Strategic courage. Development. Machiavelli discovered that good people often remained silent, not because they lacked moral clarity, but because they lacked strategic thinking about how to oppose destructive forces effectively without destroying themselves in the process. Machiavelli wrote, "The goal is not reckless confrontation that destroys the good person's ability to continue fighting, but strategic opposition that effectively challenges destructive behavior while preserving the capacity for ongoing resistance." Machiavelli instructed virtuous individuals to develop what he called calculated courage. Learning to assess risks accurately, choose battles strategically, and oppose destructive forces in ways that were both effective and sustainable over time. He taught them to build alliances with other morally aware people, to document and expose destructive behavior systematically, and to create organized resistance rather than relying on individual confrontation alone. Phase 3. Sustained resistance. Cultivation. The final phase involved what Machiavelli called institutional courage, developing the capacity to maintain ongoing opposition to destructive forces regardless of social pressure, personal cost, or temporary setbacks. Machiavelli wrote, "The strategically courageous person understands that opposing evil is not a single act of heroism, but a lifetime commitment to ensuring that virtue maintains its voice and power in human affairs." This required developing what Machiavelli called principled persistence, the ability to continue fighting for values and institutions even when resistance became difficult, unpopular, or personally costly. Machiavelli taught that sustained courage meant accepting that protecting what you value requires ongoing vigilance and regular willingness to endure discomfort, conflict, and opposition from those who benefit from destructive systems. Because Machiavelli understood that silence either enabled the complete destruction of civilized society or forced individuals to develop the courage that preserves virtue against vice. Therefore, he studied both successful and unsuccessful cases to understand what determined whether good people learned strategic courage or remained dangerously silent. The case of civilizational collapse through silence. Machiavelli documented numerous historical examples where good people's systematic silence had led to the complete corruption and eventual collapse of institutions, governments, and moral systems. He wrote about republics where virtuous citizens remained silent while witnessing gradual corruption until the entire system was controlled by those who had no moral constraints, about institutions where good people avoided confrontation until destructive individuals had gained complete power, and about societies where moral individuals chose comfort over conflict until virtue had no voice or influence in human affairs. These cases represented what Machiavelli saw as the inevitable consequence of systematic virtue silence, the complete victory of destructive forces, and the elimination of everything good people claim to value. The case of strategic courage. Success. Machiavelli extensively studied historical figures and societies that had successfully developed strategic courage to resist destructive forces while preserving and protecting virtuous institutions and values. He was particularly impressed by individuals and groups who had learned to oppose corruption, abuse, and destructive behavior strategically and persistently, creating organized resistance that was effective enough to preserve virtue while being sustainable enough to continue over time. Machiavelli wrote about leaders who had developed what he called principled resistance, the ability to fight for values and institutions through strategic action that acknowledged risks while accepting them as necessary costs for preserving what they valued most. These successful cases demonstrated that virtue could triumph over vice when good people developed the courage to act strategically and persistently rather than choosing silence and hoping that problems would resolve themselves. Machiavelli's own courage development. Most significantly, Machiavelli documented his own transformation from someone who initially believed that wise people avoided political conflict to someone who understood that avoiding conflict with destructive forces was actually enabling those forces to gain complete control. Machiavelli wrote, "I learned through bitter experience that remaining silent about corruption and abuse in the hope of maintaining my safety and comfort actually ensured that corruption and abuse would spread until they consumed everything I had tried to protect through inaction." Machiavelli's breakthrough came when he realized that his silence wasn't protecting anything. It was collaborating with the destruction of everything he claimed to value about good governance, institutional integrity, and civilized society. This realization transformed his approach to political and social engagement, moving from strategic silence to strategic courage that accepted conflict as necessary cost for preserving virtue in human affairs. Because individuals who witness destructive behavior often struggle to distinguish between wise prudence and dangerous silence, therefore Machiavelli emphasized the crucial importance of learning what he called courage versus cowardice recognition. Specific indicators that distinguish strategic caution from collaborating silence. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, "The wise person must learn to distinguish between prudent timing that serves effective resistance and convenient delay that serves comfortable avoidance of necessary confrontation." Machiavelli identified three essential characteristics that distinguish strategic courage from dangerous silence. Characteristic 1, action planning versus indefinite delay. Machiavelli wrote, "Strategic prudence involves specific planning for effective action at the appropriate time, while dangerous silence involves indefinite postponement of action while hoping that problems will resolve themselves without requiring confrontation." Strategically courageous people would assess risks, build alliances, gather information, and develop specific plans for opposing destructive behavior effectively, even if they chose to delay immediate action for tactical reasons. Silently dangerous. People would avoid making any concrete plans for resistance, would find endless reasons to delay action indefinitely, and would hope that someone else would take responsibility for confronting obvious wrongs. Characteristic 2, principled boundaries versus unlimited accommodation. Machiavelli identified strategic courage as involving clear principles about what behavior was unacceptable and required opposition regardless of personal cost or convenience. Machiavelli wrote, "The strategically courageous person maintains non-negotiable standards for behavior that they will oppose, regardless of consequences, while the dangerously silent person continuously adjusts their boundaries to avoid confrontation until no boundaries remain." Courageous people would identify specific lines that could not be crossed without triggering their active opposition, even if they were strategic about how that opposition was expressed. Silent people would continuously rationalize increasingly destructive behavior to avoid having to take action, gradually accommodating worse and worse behavior until they had no standards left that required defense. Characteristic 3, alliance building versus isolated avoidance. Machiavelli observed that strategic courage involved connecting with others who shared similar values and concerns, creating organized resistance to destructive forces rather than expecting individual action alone to be sufficient. Machiavelli wrote, "The strategically courageous person seeks to build coalitions of resistance with others who recognize the same threats, while the dangerously silent person isolates themselves and avoids connecting with others who might encourage or expect action." Courageous people would actively seek out others who shared their concerns and would work to create organized opposition that was more effective than individual resistance. Silent people would avoid discussing problems with others who might expect them to take action and would isolate themselves from situations where their inaction would be obvious or questioned. The assessment process. Machiavelli developed specific indicators for evaluating whether silence serves strategy or cowardice. Strategic silence involves specific planning for future action based on improved circumstances or better positioning for effective resistance. Dangerous silence involves indefinite delay without specific plans or concrete preparation for eventual action. Strategic caution accepts confrontation as inevitable and prepares for it systematically. Dangerous silence hopes confrontation can be avoided entirely and makes no preparation for necessary conflicts. Evaluation protocol. Machiavelli taught individuals to assess their silence regularly. Am I remaining silent because I have a specific strategy for more effective action at a better time, or am I avoiding action indefinitely? Do I have non-negotiable principles that I will defend regardless of personal cost, or do I continuously adjust my boundaries to avoid confrontation? Am I building alliances and preparing for necessary resistance, or am I isolating myself from others who share my concerns? Machiavelli emphasized, the goal is not reckless confrontation, but honest recognition of whether your silence serves effective resistance or comfortable avoidance. Because strategic courage serves both individual integrity and civilizational preservation when practiced by morally aware individuals, therefore, Machiavelli viewed the development of resistance to destructive forces as essential not just for personal authenticity, but for the survival of virtue in human society. Machiavelli wrote in Discourses on Livy, "The individual who learns to oppose evil strategically rather than remaining silent serves not only their own moral integrity, but demonstrates what becomes possible when virtue exercises its power rather than abdicating it to vice." He believed that people who successfully develop strategic courage become what he called virtue guardians, individuals who demonstrate that good people can effectively resist destructive forces when they choose action over comfort. The 4 stages of strategic courage development. Stage 1, silence recognition without self-hatred. The first transformation occurs when individuals learn to recognize that their silence has been enabling destructive behavior without falling into paralyzing guilt or despair about their previous inaction. Machiavelli called this honest assessment, understanding that recognizing previous silence serves future courage rather than punishing past choices. Machiavelli wrote, "The beginning of courage is recognizing that your silence has had consequences, not to torture yourself about the past, but to motivate different choices in the future." Stage 2, strategic planning without reckless action. The second stage involves developing effective methods for opposing destructive forces while avoiding the martyrdom that eliminates your capacity for ongoing resistance. Machiavelli called this intelligent resistance, learning to fight for values in ways that are both principled and sustainable. Machiavelli observed, the strategically courageous person learns to choose battles they can win and fight them in ways that preserve their ability to continue fighting. Stage 3, sustained resistance without temporary discouragement. The third transformation happens when individuals develop the psychological resilience necessary to maintain opposition to destructive forces, even when resistance becomes difficult, unpopular, or temporarily unsuccessful. Machiavelli called this principled persistence, maintaining commitment to values regardless of short-term setbacks or social pressure. Machiavelli wrote, "The privilege of strategic courage is discovering that protecting what you value requires accepting ongoing conflict rather than hoping for permanent peace." Stage 4, institutional protection without preaching. The final stage involves what Machiavelli called systematic virtue defense, creating organized resistance to destructive forces that protects virtuous institutions and values without becoming preachy or superior about courage. Machiavelli observed, "The fully developed courageous person serves civilizational preservation, not through lecturing others about their silence, but through demonstrating what becomes possible when virtue chooses action over comfort." The courage becomes civilizational protection. Machiavelli believed that individuals who successfully develop strategic courage serve a vital protective function for human civilization itself. They prove that virtue can exercise power effectively, demonstrate that good people can organize successful resistance to destructive forces, and create templates for institutional protection that preserve the possibility of civilized society. Machiavelli wrote, "What is not defended by virtue will inevitably be conquered by vice." Strategically courageous individuals help preserve the institutions and values that make civilized human life possible by refusing to allow destructive forces to operate without opposition. But Machiavelli warned about specific pitfalls that can derail strategic courage development. Because the path of developing effective resistance to destructive forces contains specific challenges. Therefore, Machiavelli documented the most common ways individuals sabotage their own courage development. Pitfall 1. The reckless martyrdom trap. Machiavelli wrote extensively about individuals who overcorrected from dangerous silence by engaging in reckless confrontation that destroyed their ability to continue fighting effectively. In The Art of War, he warned, "The danger is that recognizing the need for courage leads to unstrategic action that eliminates the courageous person from the conflict, serving vice better than continued strategic resistance would have." Individuals who fell into this trap would engage in dramatic confrontations that felt heroic, but actually removed them from positions where they could continue fighting effectively, choosing emotional satisfaction over strategic effectiveness. Pitfall 2. The perfect timing paralysis. Machiavelli documented cases where individuals became so focused on finding the perfect strategic moment for action that they never actually took action, using strategic thinking as a sophisticated form of continued avoidance. Machiavelli wrote, "Strategic courage requires accepting that no timing will ever feel perfect for confrontation, and that waiting for ideal circumstances often means waiting forever while destructive forces grow stronger." These individuals would continuously find reasons why current circumstances weren't optimal for action, using legitimate strategic concerns as excuses for continued inaction that enabled destructive forces to gain more power. Pitfall 3. The superior courage complex. Machiavelli observed that some individuals who developed strategic courage would become arrogant about their willingness to act, looking down on people who were still learning to overcome dangerous silence. They would become judgmental about others' fear or hesitation, preachy about the need for courage, and superior about their own willingness to confront destructive forces. Machiavelli warned, "When courage becomes identity rather than necessary action, the person has lost the humility required for effective resistance." Pitfall 4. The discouragement retreat. Even individuals who had successfully developed strategic courage could regress into dangerous silence during periods of setbacks, defeats, or when resistance became particularly difficult or costly. They would convince themselves that their efforts weren't making a difference, that the destructive forces were too powerful to resist, or that continuing to fight was futile. Machiavelli emphasized, courage is not a permanent achievement, but an ongoing choice that must be renewed regularly, despite setbacks and difficulties. The courage maintenance. Machiavelli developed ongoing practices for maintaining strategic courage development, regular assessment of what destructive forces are threatening values and institutions that you care about. Continued alliance building with others who share similar concerns and commitment to principled resistance. Ongoing strategic planning that balances principled action with sustainable resistance methods. Connection with other courageous individuals for mutual support, and reality checking about effective resistance strategies. Personal resilience practices that maintain psychological capacity for ongoing conflict and confrontation. Machiavelli wrote, "Strategic courage is not a single heroic act, but a lifetime commitment to ensuring that virtue maintains its voice and power in opposition to forces that would destroy everything you value." Because Machiavelli understood dangerous silence within the context of broader civilizational survival, therefore, he viewed individuals who developed strategic courage as serving essential functions for human society's preservation and development. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote, "The individual who learns to oppose destructive forces strategically serves as guardian of civilization itself, demonstrating what becomes possible when virtue exercises power rather than abdicating to vice." Through silence, he believed that people with strategic courage serve as what he called institutional defenders, individuals whose principled resistance proves that virtue can be powerful when it chooses action over comfortable inaction. The historical pattern. Machiavelli observed that throughout history, civilizations survived or collapsed based on whether virtue remained silent or developed strategic courage to resist destructive forces. Machiavelli wrote, "What appears in the strategically courageous individual first as personal resistance later manifests in society as institutional protection, reduced tolerance for corruption and abuse, and the preservation of values and systems that make civilized life possible." Modern manifestations. Machiavelli believed that in any era, individuals with strategic courage might be demonstrating resistance patterns that explain effective versus ineffective opposition to destructive forces, principled versus compromised. Responses to corruption and abuse, strategic versus reckless confrontation methods, and the difference between temporary accommodation and permanent collaboration with evil. Machiavelli's insight. The strategically courageous individual feels the threat to civilization first and most intensely. Their personal resistance often demonstrates what entire societies need to learn about preserving virtue through active opposition rather than losing it through comfortable silence. The service without sacrifice. Machiavelli's crucial insight was that virtue serves civilizational preservation best when it exercises power strategically rather than remaining silent and hoping evil will constrain itself. The goal isn't reckless martyrdom that eliminates good people from the conflict, but strategic resistance that effectively opposes destructive forces while preserving the capacity for ongoing resistance. Machiavelli wrote, "The strategically courageous person serves civilization not by sacrificing themselves heroically, but by demonstrating what virtue becomes when it exercises its power intelligently and persistently in opposition to forces that would destroy everything good people value." The ultimate strategy. At the highest level of development, Machiavelli observed that individuals with strategic courage learn to oppose destructive forces naturally and effectively, resisting evil without being consumed by it, fighting for values without losing perspective, and maintaining principled opposition without becoming bitter or hopeless about human nature. Machiavelli called this institutional courage, the ability to serve civilizational preservation through strategic resistance that accepts conflict as necessary, cost for protecting what makes human life valuable and meaningful. Remember Machiavelli's observation of the good citizen's fatal silence. Through studying societies that survived versus those that collapsed, Machiavelli discovered that transformation was possible. Those who developed strategic courage learned to oppose destructive forces effectively while building institutional resistance that protected virtuous values and systems. They found ways to fight for what they valued without destroying themselves in the process. They created organized opposition that was more effective than individual resistance and more sustainable than heroic martyrdom. Most importantly, they stopped viewing silence as protection from evil and began understanding it as Machiavelli called collaboration with evil through the removal of opposition. Machiavelli wrote about this transformation. The strategically courageous person learns not to avoid conflict entirely, but to engage in conflict strategically, not to remain silent for comfort, but to speak and act for preservation of what they value most. Their resistance serves not just personal integrity, but civilizational survival. This represents Machiavelli's coldest law about silence, that good people's systematic refusal to oppose evil creates the conditions that allow destructive forces to gain complete control over institutions, values, and human society itself. And this silence will either lead to the complete collapse of everything good people claim to value, or force them to develop exactly the strategic courage that serves civilizational preservation, resistance that protects virtue through active opposition rather than losing it through comfortable inaction. Your tendency towards silence in the face of obvious wrongs isn't wisdom or prudence. It's collaboration with destructive forces through the removal of opposition they would otherwise face. You're not being diplomatic when you avoid confronting corruption, abuse, or systematic destruction. You're enabling these forces to operate without the resistance that virtue could provide if it chose courage over comfort. The question isn't whether you should engage in reckless confrontation that destroys your ability to continue fighting. The question is whether you'll develop the strategic courage necessary to oppose destructive forces effectively while preserving your capacity for ongoing resistance. Machiavelli's strategic courage method offers a path from dangerous silence to effective resistance, from comfortable inaction to principled opposition, from civilizational collaboration with evil to civilizational preservation through virtue. You were born to protect what you value, not to remain silent while it's destroyed, but to serve civilizational preservation through strategic resistance that demonstrates what virtue becomes when it exercises its power intelligently and persistently. The world needs your voice and action, but it needs them expressed through strategic courage that effectively opposes destructive forces while preserving the institutions and values that make civilized life possible. Your silence is not your safety. Your silence in the face of obvious evil is your collaboration with that evil. Learn to oppose destructively strategically, and you become exactly what Machiavelli believed strategically courageous individuals were meant to be: guardians of civilization who prove that virtue can be powerful when it chooses action over comfortable inaction. Machiavelli's coldest law about silence wasn't that it creates personal danger. It's that systematic silence by good people creates civilizational danger by removing all opposition to forces that would destroy everything virtue claims to value. The cold reality isn't in recognizing evil. It's in failing to develop the strategic courage that transforms silent observers into effective defenders of what makes human civilization valuable and sustainable. You are not too small to make a difference against destructive forces. You are exactly what civilizational preservation requires. Once you learn to exercise strategic courage as intelligently as Machiavelli learned to analyze political power. If you recognize yourself in Machiavelli's description of the dangerously silent good person, you're part of a crucial group that civilization depends on for institutional protection and value preservation. Share in the comments what keeps you silent in the face of obvious wrongs. Your courage development connects with others, learning to transform comfortable silence into strategic resistance. Subscribe for more insights into Machiavelli's discoveries about power, resistance, and the strategic methods necessary for preserving virtue in a world where destructive forces never remain silent. If you're ready to explore more of Machiavelli's insights about strategic action in dangerous situations, check out my video on Machiavelli's most dangerous discovery about timing, where I reveal the specific methods for choosing when and how to act effectively against destructive forces while preserving your capacity for ongoing resistance. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.